Okay. Well, we're gathered here to take somewhere between refuge and consolation in consecutive thought. It's all we have, so let's do that. There is a handout, though it's not very useful this time. It's just a sort of aid memoir, and because I hope you're expecting to have something to scribble on during that time. So last time I started off with some further distinctions beyond the original pragmatic story that I told that I think makes the pragmatic metavocabulary more expressively powerful. And that was to introduce explicit vocabulary in our metavocabulary to distinguish differences of social perspective in the normative, I want to say, fine structure of discursive practice. And that was two distinctions. The first is the distinction between normative statuses, like commitment and entitlement, responsibility and authority, and attitudes of taking or treating somebody as exhibiting one of these statuses, as being responsible, being committed, being authoritative. And the second distinction is within the attitudes between attributing a status to somebody else and undertaking or acknowledging it oneself. Now, one issue that I didn't talk about last time, but want to talk about today, is what's the relation between these, between normative attitudes and normative statuses. Is one of them prior? Can we understand one of them in terms of the other, or what? But my principal efforts last time were to talk about the locutions that in ordinary language we can use to make explicit those attitudes, in particular attributing paradigmatically commitments to someone else, that we have locutions, propositional attitude ascriptions, that let us say that what we're doing is adopting this attitude of attributing a normative status. I can say, John claims that, or John believes that, John is committed to the claim that, and there I'm saying explicitly what I'm doing in adopting this attitude towards somebody. It's explicit because it gets in the form of a claimable. These propositional attitude ascription, those are sentences, and you can assert them, so you can challenge them, defend them. That's what we mean by explicit. And I invited comparison, though I didn't myself try to walk through this, between the role that logical locutions like conditionals and negations play in extending the base vocabulary so that we could talk about reason relations, make them explicit in the language. In the same way, adding propositional attitude ascribing locutions lets us make explicit what we're doing now in using expressions, linguistic expressions, according to reason relations. So they have in common explicitation by extension of a base vocabulary, but otherwise what's being made explicit is very different. The reason relations that are common to the pragmatic, what's specified in pragmatic and what's specified in semantic metavocabularies on the one hand, and one of the things we can do, adopt a normative attitude of attribution on the side of the pragmatics. But the basic message last time was that the distinction of social perspective between attributing a commitment to somebody else and acknowledging or undertaking or claiming it oneself gets made explicit, anyway, is manifested overtly in the distinction between two kinds of propositional attitude ascription, ascriptions de dicto and ascriptions de re. So, I talked about that distinction in general. It's not specific to propositional attitude descriptions. We saw there's a tensed version of the de dicto de re distinction as well. But the one we care about is the one that shows up in propositional attitude descriptions. And maybe the main claim I made that I hope is tantalizing, suggestive, is that we can functionally identify the principal locutions in ordinary language that we use to make explicit the representational dimension of conceptual content, that is, that we use to make explicit the distinction between what we're saying on the one hand, conceptually contentful things, and what we're talking or thinking about or thinking of on the other hand. And it's those uses of or about that I claim we can functionally pick out in ordinary language as playing the expressive role of making explicit the distinction between what commitments are attributed and what are undertaken. And that's because in the nature of things, the expressive job of ascriptions requires that they do two things, that in asserting them, one is on the one hand attributing a commitment to somebody else, but on the other hand, one is undertaking or acknowledging the commitment, the content of the assertion, the ascriptional commitment oneself. And so a question can arise about any bit of what you say. Well, is that functioning in the sentence to specify the commitment you're attributing, or is it in addition functioning to specify the commitment you have undertaken? So that was a bold claim about the significance of the de dicto de re distinction as applied to propositional attitude descriptions. And I mentioned that when I say the de dicto de re distinction there, I'm understanding it in a different way than most of the recent literature does, which is actually talking, I think, about a special class of de re ascriptions that involve object-involving expressions. That's Gareth Evans' notion. Anyway, all of that is meant to be talking about what we did last time. But that sort of left us, suppose we take all that on board and say, okay, there's this interesting connection between the distinction of social perspective between attributing a commitment to somebody else and acknowledging it oneself on the one hand, and the specifically representational dimension of discourse, the one where it's reaching beyond things that are claimables to something in the world that those claimables are answering to. How are we to understand the significance of that? What is the connection between this distinction of social perspective and the notion of representation? And I suggested one reason to think that we weren't completely on the wrong track in getting to the point of asking that question was if we think about a version of the JTB, justified true belief, account of knowledge that understands what you're doing when you take somebody to know something, that says, well, you're taking them to believe it, that's attributing a commitment. You're taking that belief to be justified, that's attributing entitlement to that commitment. But the truth, what corresponds to the truth condition, if we ask, what are you doing when you take someone to know something, on the side of truth, what you're doing is acknowledging that commitment yourself, undertaking or endorsing that commitment yourself. And so the difference between belief and true belief is not the difference between two different kinds of things you can attribute to somebody. It's rather the difference between attributing a commitment and acknowledging it yourself. So that's already suggesting the mere fact that you can read pragmatically, that's in terms of what you're doing rather than what you're saying. When you say that somebody knows something, that you can understand the, as it were, representational dimension of that, what distinguishes true beliefs from beliefs, that you can understand that precisely in terms of the social distinction between attributing and acknowledging a commitment. But that just suggests that there's a relatively robust phenomena here. It doesn't tell us sort of what to make of it. And I'd like to say more about that issue today. But for us, there's a further challenge that's offered by seeing the connection in de dicto and de re ascriptions, seeing the connection there between this distinction of social perspective, between attributing to another and acknowledging oneself on the one hand, and the representational dimension of conceptual content, I'll say. We have another issue connected with that, because in the fourth meeting, I introduced the Hlobil isomorphism as an insight into precisely the representational dimension of conceptual content that said, if you want to understand that dimension, you should look first at the level of reason relations, not at the level of sentences, never mind at the level of term reference or predicate reference. I indicated this was fully turning the traditional order of explanation on its head in the way Sellers congratulated Kant on having done, seeing the reason relations as first. But just as we can ask what's the relation between representation and this social distinction, if by representation we mean what shows up in de re ascriptions of propositional attitude, we can also ask how is what shows up in ascriptions, de re ascriptions of propositional attitude, related to this Hlobil isomorphism, which we said was going to be the key to unlocking the representational dimension of discourse. So we've got, as it were, too many ways into the notion of representation here, and what we'd like to do is understand the relation between those. And as I hope I've made clear by my emphasis in the last few remarks, there's a serious question here about the relation between what you're doing in saying something and what you're saying in saying that. So I haven't said sort of what knowledge is as a status. I've suggested that taking somebody to know something isn't just standing at arm's length and attributing something to them. You don't attribute knowledge in the same sense in which you attribute belief, because taking somebody to know something involves you more intimately. It involves your undertaking commitments that are not merely expressing your attributions to somebody else, but doing something more. And it's that something more, that endorsement, that somehow is marking your acknowledgement of the responsibility of what you say to what you're talking about. So they say, at this point, my sense is we ought to feel, even if we've understood each of the puzzle pieces that they put on the table, still, how do these relate to one another? It says, any one of these stories about representation is interesting, but this is really three stories: social perspective, de re ascriptions, and the Hlobil isomorphism. And we really like to know how these all get together. And the connection I want to claim is that at the base of the notion of representation is a normative notion. This is a lesson that Kant taught, I think, in the end, that though I and everybody else who learned this lesson from Kant learned from Hegel that this was Kant's story, it's hard to get from Kant. But, I mean, he doesn't say this. It makes sense of what he does, that the notion of our utterances as norm-governed is where the representational dimension comes in. And that's what is expressed, manifested in the De Dicto de Re expression of the distinction of social perspective. So, okay, so that's where I'm going. I want to claim that the notion that the representational dimension of discourse, well, it's a house with many mansions. There's a lot of fine structure to that dimension, and we need to look a little more closely at that. In particular, the notion of normative governance of representings by representeds is only half of what we need to think about in order to understand, well, it's at most half of what we need to understand the representational dimension of discourse. There's a non-normative notion, a notion we would express with a lethic modality of subjunctive tracking of representeds by representings. And it's these two notions that we need to understand. And in particular, we need to see how they connive to institute, maintain, and improve the Hlobil isomorphism. That is, it's because of the normative governance of representings by representeds and the subjunctive tracking of representeds by representings that the Hlobil isomorphism holds. Insofar as it does hold, it's never perfect. We can see what it would be. Okay, that's where we're going here. This involves our continuing to articulate the pragmatic metavocabulary that we talk in, and the idea that the place to look to understand representation is really your pragmatics, not your semantics, lines up with the distinction between purely formal semantics and philosophical semantics, where purely formal semantics, people use these terms somewhat differently, but I'm telling you how I'm going to use them. Purely formal semantics stipulates associations of expressions with semantic interpretants, of basic expressions with semantic interpretants, in some expressively powerful semantic metavocabulary, and then shows you how to compute associations of semantic interpretants with complex expressions in the language, entirely on the basis of the association of semantic interpretants with basic expressions that you stipulated at the beginning. Formal semantics is not addressing the questions, well, what should the semantic interpretants be of any kind of expression? You've got to have decided that before you do your formal semantics. And what is it about the use of these expressions in virtue of which they get associated with these semantic interpretants of that kind. You can see this division of labor in possible world semantics, say, where many people were happy to use the semantic apparatus of possible worlds, do their formal semantics in that, without worrying about how in the world we could be related to possible worlds understood as concrete particulars that we're not spatiotemporally related to. Well, then how is it that everything we mean could be a matter of our relation to these things? That's not a question for the formal semanticist. It's a question for the one doing the philosophical semantics that includes the use of the language and is, I would say, principally concerned, pragmatics, with saying what it is about the use of expressions in virtue of which they express the conceptual contents that they do. I pointed out that Fine is very interested in and articulate about the relation between his semantics and his metaphysics, but has essentially no interest in the relation between his semantics and any pragmatics. Just doesn't have anything to say about, well, anyway, hasn't. I don't know, I never actually asked him this, but he doesn't write about what it is about our use of expressions in virtue of which those expressions, those sentential expressions, are associated with a set, possibly uncountably infinite, of states that are truth makers for them, and another set, possibly uncountably infinite, of states that are false makers for them. That's another task. That's not the one he's doing. Well, I don't, to a first approximation, have anything to say about the relation between the semantics and metaphysics, but want to address this pragmatic issue. Yeah, Nikki.
Maybe
no, please, that's good.
Say the exact same thing about this, but philosophers of language like to apply a distinction between semantics and meta-semantics. I feel like I'm hearing echoes of that distinction in your distinction between formal and philosophical. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah. Meta-semantics, it's also Van Frossen in a thing, at least that's already in the box for our discussion of singular terms, talks about this as external semantics instead of internal semantics. And I'm happy enough to talk about pragmatics and semantics as well. But most philosophers of language have, from my point of view, an extremely attenuated notion of pragmatics. It's not the whole use of the language. It's an addendum to our semantics. Okay, yeah.
Just as a follow-up to that, so there's one way of thinking about, so the meta-semantics, semantics distinction puts into the box of meta-semantics whatever it is you need to say, such that you have a story about what the semantic interpretants are for your semantics. And it sounds like what you're saying, at least in the way that you presented philosophical semantics, is it's a restriction on that to whatever pragmatic story you have to tell about.
Gee, I was just thinking it was an extension of it, because it's not just explaining your semantic interpretants. It's describing the practices or what it is about the expressions that connects them to the semantic interpretants, where they're pretty much the use of them is the only straw floating there. The question, I would say, just is what vocabulary are you allowed to use in specifying that use that can be sparer or okay, so where I'm going is to talk about that philosophical semantics and to talk about what institutes, maintains, and develops the isomorphism at the level of reason relations between what we take to follow from what and be incompatible with what, our practical attitudes on the one hand, and what really follows from what and is incompatible with what, as understood in alethic modal terms. We're using the truth maker meta vocabulary there. And my claim is that there's going to be two dimensions to that, which are two dimensions of the representational aspect of conceptual content. There's what I'm calling normative governance and subjunctive tracking. So I want to talk about both of those today. And at least for me, I've continued to find helpful a little story that I'd been telling and guiding myself by for some time, and only relatively recently realized that it's actually Sellers' story that I had read years ago, and like so much of it, internalized to the point I couldn't tell where his brain stopped and mine began. But in his very early writings, he talks about having a concept of an acid. And there's a sort of toy example where you say, and I'm going to put all this in my idiom, you use the concept with the circumstances of appropriate application, the things that are reasons for it, prominently including a commitment that anything that tastes sour is an acid. That's a sufficient reason for taking something to be an acid. It implies that it's an acid. And using it with appropriate consequences of application, what follows from applying it, that anything that's an acid will turn litmus paper red. So we have a little implication curled up in this concept. In using that concept at all, you're committing yourself to the propriety of the inference from tasting sour to turning litmus paper red. And that's basically the substantive content of that concept, is to license that inference. But that's a fragile inference. To commit yourself to that is to make yourself vulnerable to finding something that tastes sour but turns litmus paper blue. Now, what are you going to do? We imagine that we have a large community that agrees about what tastes sour and doesn't. So you don't have to worry about measurement error here, and agrees about whether something is red or blue, and further that those are incompatible. And so if you find something like this, you find yourself with commitments that are incompatible by your own lights. You're committed to its being an acid, and it's not being an acid. You're committed to its turning the litmus paper red, and you're committed to the litmus paper being blue from looking at it. So you need to change something. The world, as it were, won't let you have that implication. It's telling you, no, you're building your semantics wrong if you have that concept. And we try something out. We say, well, maybe it's only clear liquids that when they taste sour, it means they're an acid. Or we shift, well, they only turn litmus paper red if the temperature is below a certain amount or within a certain range. At any rate, we fiddle with it. And the thought is, well, we're the wealthy inheritors of a big tradition of people having curled up implications in their concepts that the world told them you need to groom and shape that. You can't have that just the way you do. And so mostly the implications and incompatibilities that articulate our empirical concepts are ones that are in step with what really follows from what and what's really incompatible with it. Usually, when we find ourselves with incompatible commitments, the problem is not that one of our concepts is defective. Sometimes it is, but most often it's not. And that's a measure of how close to an actual isomorphism there is between what we take to follow and be incompatible with what, and what really follows and is incompatible with what. At least in our everyday sorts of dealings, but including the everyday dealings in our scientific labs, where mostly we know what we're doing. Now, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, that example's really interesting to me in some part because often our concept of an acid is often more theoretical in nature than, say, our concept of blue. So for instance, we would want to say something like, clear conflict, right? It can't be blue and red at the same time, right? But it seems that the conflict between turning blue and being acid is a bit different because there's a lot of extra steps in the sense that it seems like because the nature of what makes something an acid is more theoretical, we can tweak that in a way where the conflict is less apparent. But the red-blue, it really can't be, right? So I'm just curious about how much you think sort of the concepts which are more theoretically based, or what the nature of that kind of conflict might be.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say inferential rather than observation, as opposed to observational rather than theoretical,
Yeah.
because I'm thinking that this is, entirely explicable at the level of concepts that have observational uses. But you're pointing out that the incompatibility between red and blue is of a different character than the incompatibility between turning the litmus paper being blue and this liquid having tasted sour and so qualified as an acid. And indeed, that's where we can make some tweaks, held in by the fact that a very large community of us agrees about what's blue and what's red, and does so in a way that separates these. By contrast, for instance, to blue and green, where it's notorious, individuals draw very different lines between those, even monoculturally. Well, that's part of what produces this friction that allows us to find ourselves with commitments that are incompatible by our own lights. It's partly because some of those judgments are wrenched from us non-inferentially. We've been trained and are wired up to be able to master non-inferential responses to things. And here I think it's worth keeping in mind Quine's discussion in his essay Epistemology Naturalized about the relative character of the observationality of concepts, that we have at the sort of outer limit of it, concepts that we all agree about in our reliable differential responsive dispositions. So everybody can tell whether the meteor needle is all the way over at the left or all the way over at the right. Whether is it reading 5? Well, that might be a problem, but way over here we can tell the colors mostly, though some of us are colorblind. But then there are other things that can be observed. The trained anthropologist or archaeologist who can tell at a glance whether that's a Toltec potsherd or an Aztec potsherd. We would have to do a lot of research and maybe testing in the laboratory to do it. She can just tell by looking at it. Within her community, that's an observable property. And Quine's interested in the way in which, in dispute resolution, a good strategy is to draw consequences that appeal to something that's observational with respect to a larger community. So you say, well, I'm not sure whether that's an acid or not, but it turned the litmus paper red. That we ought to be able to, agree about, even if we can't this other. Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the things that we would like from thinking about this example, which I think is suggestive as to how it's not just good fortune that our inferences work as well as they do, there's some directionality here. There's some notion of progress or improvement, of better fit of our attitudes, the reason relations we take to obtain, to the ones that really do. And so I want to talk about this notion of sort of improvement of fit under two headings. The one is empirical. We haven't talked about the empirical dimension of conceptual content. This is a good place to do that. And the other is historical, the historical dimension, how reason relations, at least on the pragmatic side, evolve and change over time. And it's that evolution over time that we're seeking to describe in a way that would underwrite assessments of changing progressively, getting better at doing its representational job. That's the dimension of the that's the sort of pragmatic way into the representational dimension that I'm interested in. Again, pointing ahead, where I'm going is I want to say there's two dimensions of relation between representings and representeds. There's a normative dimension and there's an alethic modal dimension. The normative governance on the one hand and the subjunctively robust tracking relation on the other hand. And if we want to think about the toy acid example, we have to think about both of those dimensions. And I think almost everybody who thinks about these thinks about this question, thinks about it in a one-sided way. That is, either focuses on the subjunctive tracking or on the normative governance. And we need to see how these come together. So one way into this is to think about different senses in which claims that we make represent the way things are. Narrower and narrower notions of representation. So at the broadest, I want to say, everything that can be used to make an assertion, this is the declarativist criterion of demarcation of, a worldly directed notion of conceptual content. Says anything you can formulate as a declarative sentence is truth evaluable. It's appropriate to ask whether that's true or not, which is already showing a certain beholdenness to how things are. Any content that you can put into a declarative sentence can be embedded as a component of a more complex sentence. That's means that it can pass the Frege-Geach test. So, there is a real boundary, and a substantial one, being marked by the declarativism, marked by declaratives, by contrast to imperatives and interrogatives, which are not used to make claims in the first instance, but to give orders, make requests, or ask questions. Those are not truth evaluable, those are not embeddable without further ado in larger assertions. At any rate, the way they embed is distinct from the way assertable sentences do. Those sentences, in order to make assertions, we've said, following Sellers, must be located in a space of implications. And furthermore, so that there can be reasons for and against them, a space of implications and incompatibilities. Those implications and incompatibilities are subjunctively robust. That is, they support not just description, but also explanation, reasoning from the applicability of one description to the applicability of another. If this description were to hold, this other one would hold. Those reason relations come with ranges of subjunctive robustness. And basically, that's the notion of content that we've been explicating all along. Sellers wants to distinguish describing, which is applying concepts being roles with respect to reason relations, wants to distinguish that from mere classification or labeling, where I differentially respond to things, but not by applying concepts. And that sort of reliable differential responsive disposition, that's ubiquitous in the non-sentient, non-sapient world. The chunk of iron rusts in the presence of oxygen and water, those environments, and not in other environments. But the key to resisting the panpsychist consequence, from drawing the panpsychist consequence from that, is to sharply distinguish what the response is. And the response of that chunk of iron is not taking up a position in a space of giving and asking for reasons. That response is not articulated by reason relations. So sapience comes with that situation in a space of implications. But we might want to narrow things at this point when we notice that statements like S ought not to have done that, S shouldn't have done that, are perfectly good declarative sentences. They're truth evaluable. We can embed them as antecedents of conditionals, and so on. They're not describing how things are, saying how things are, anyway, in the same sense that simple descriptions do. What's the difference there? And here I think we can help ourselves to Anscombe's distinction of directions of normative fit, talk about what we ought to do, is talking about how things should be, relevant to practical deliberations about what to do. That's different from simply saying how things are. So I'm sure you know the story. Anscombe describes a detective following a shopper through the grocery store, and the shopper has a list, and the detective has a list, but we're looking at the difference of normative direction of fit of their lists, and we can see that from mistakes. So suppose when they come out of the store, there's a discrepancy between what's on one of the lists and what's in the basket. The list says onions, and there are no onions in the basket. If it's the shopper's list, it's the basket that was wrong. The list is authoritative over what should be in the basket. The basket is responsible for its correctness as a shopping basket to the list. If the detective wrote down onions and there's no onions in the shopping cart, it's the detective's list that's defective. His list is responsible for its correctness to what's in the shopper's cart. So the question is, which of the list and the cart is authoritative for the correctness of the other, which is responsible for its correctness to the other. These are normative directions of fit, as she says. And this is so much more intuitive a way of making this point. Well, this is why this is one of the differences between reading Anscombe and reading Kant. But Kant's revolutionary idea about representation, which was the big idea of Enlightenment epistemology. I sort of described how Descartes was able to loosen the relations of resemblance that bound together appearance and reality in the old picture, so as to accommodate things like Galileo's representing periods of time by lengths of line and accelerations by areas of triangle, where resemblance doesn't help us, yet a more abstract notion of representation that was behind the empiricists' picture of ideas. They were intrinsically representings, but Kant's idea was that to talk about a representational relation requires using normative vocabulary. That to say that this is a representing of this represented thing is to assign authority to the thing that's represented, authority over assessments of the correctness of the representing as a representing of that represented. It's to say that qua representing of that represented, it's responsible for its correctness as a representing of that represented to how it is with what counts in that sense as represented. So insofar as that's right, that was a good idea, he's telling us if you want to understand representation, you have to understand these normative relations. And that, more than anything else, is what distinguished German idealism from previous philosophy, was thinking of representation in those normative terms. Anscombe describes this by the distinguishing between the prescriptive significance of the shopper's list and the descriptive significance of the detective's list. I should mention, for all Anscombe says, those are the only directions of normative fit, and they evidently aren't. They might be the principal basic directions of normative fit, but an absolutely crucial notion of normative fit is a test-operate, test-exit cycle. This is starting, what we're doing this is what distinguishes straight schedule algorithms from conditional branch schedule algorithms in computing. A tote cycle, you test and see whether some condition is satisfied. Have you unlocked the lock? No, then you operate. You try a key, the next key on the keychain, you try in the lock, and then you test, is the lock open? No. Then you go to the next key. If yes, then you exit. So this tote cycle, a very basic sort of thing. It's the testing has the descriptive order of direction of normative fit. It then prescribes an operation that has the prescriptive direction of fit. You test again, that's the descriptive. The cycle is one of description and prescription, description and prescription until you get out of it. That's a direction of normative fit too. It's built out of those other things. I'll call that Kantian and Enskomian normative analysis of representation. That's what I mean by normative governance of representings by representeds. That what's represented is, by definition now, what serves as a normative standard for the assessment of the correctness of what counts as a representing of that represented in virtue of being subject to normative assessments that the represented serves as the normative standard for. Okay, this has been rather a long way around to the claim I want to make, which is that it's that sense of normative governance, that aspect of descriptive uses that's made explicit by de re ascriptions of propositional attitude. That's what happens when I assess the commitment I attribute on the basis of the commitment I acknowledge. That is, what I take to be true serves as the standard for assessment of the correctness of what of the commitment that I'm attributing to someone else. Well, there's a claim. That's the dimension. That's the aspect of the representational dimension that one invokes by doing what you're doing in making a de re ascription. I want to be careful about that. Now let me fill this thought in a little bit. I mean, part of the puzzle was that the de dicto de re, articulating the distinction between attributing and acknowledging, that distinction of social perspective, the world ain't in it yet. This is all just among us. It's all in the pragmatic use. But it's pointing to our acknowledgement of there being a standard for assessing the correctness of our attitudes. And that's all you get from the distinction between attributing and acknowledging, as it's manifested even in the explicit form of de re ascriptions, that it's the form of taking or treating things as subject to normative assessment from outside that attitude. That's all we're going to get. But I don't know, this is the point at which Sellers says, let's beat around in the neighboring bushes a little bit, see if we can guess that's what you do when you're hunting and see what runs out that you could capture. People who believe that the de dicto de re distinction marks a distinction of two kinds of belief rather than, as I've been urging, two kinds of ascription of belief, often say, and the difference between them is that the de re form of belief is the one that answers to how things really are, and the de dicto is the one you want to look at if you want to predict or explain the behavior of the person you're attributing the belief to. And you can sort of see what they're on about. There is a phenomenon they're on about, but I think even sort of bracketing the problems about thinking the distinction is applying to beliefs rather than ascriptions, I still think that's wrong. And that is that only the de dicto beliefs or ascriptions are relevant to assessments of the behavior, or predictions, explanations of the behavior of the one whose attitudes you're attributing. Think about it in a practical case, so an intention rather than a belief here. We have Nicole, who is out hunting. She's hunting deer. As Quine would put it, she's not hunting some particular deer, she's seeking relief from dead deerlessness. Just wants to get some deer or other. Now, suppose we know that she believes that this creature that has emerged in front of her, this tawny creature, is a deer. And she's licensed and ready to go. She believes that the tawny thing in front of her is a deer. That's a de dicto ascription. And that's clearly what you want if you want to know whether she's going to pull the trigger or not. She believes that it is a deer. But if we contrast the de re and say, well, actually she believes of a cow that it's a deer. It's just the neighbor's cow that wandered into the woods, and the poor tawny thing, she's going to shoot it, all right. Well, that's the thing. We can predict her behavior from the de re ascription every bit as much as we can from the de dicto ascription. The de dicto ascription says she'll pull the trigger. The de re ascription says, and she'll kill a cow, not a deer. It depends on whether we want to specify her behavior, as it were, from her point of view. What's she trying to do? Then you want to be reasoning with de dicto specifications of her beliefs. The de re ones are equally important for predicting or explaining her behavior. She comes back and we say, wait a minute, why did she shoot a cow? She was deer hunting. Well, that feature of her behavior we can explain with the de re ascription. She believed of a cow that it was a deer. In both cases, we're explaining her behavior. Why did she pull the trigger? Why is there a dead cow? Why did she kill a cow? We're just explaining different aspects of her behavior. I'm saying that mostly to put to one side the idea that the de re ascriptions aren't about what she's doing, but they are assessing the correctness of her beliefs relative to a standard that's set by, well, the attributor's beliefs. What are they going to use to do that? So my claim is that we see in the description between attribution and acknowledgement a relation of authority and responsibility that underwrites assessments of correctness of the attributed beliefs. So there is an aspect of the representational dimension of discourse that is made explicit by de re ascriptions of propositional attitude. It's that to be describing the way things are is to take what you say to be normatively answerable to, governed by something that you're talking about, something that is described, not the describing of it. That's making explicit this relation between, this normative relation of authority of what's described over describings of it, the responsibility of the describings for their correctness to what is described. So that's a genuine aspect of representational relations as they sort of show up in the pragmatics. It's not enough for empirical description yet. And we can see that when we see that some descriptive uses of language that are fully norm governed by their subject matter aren't empirical descriptions. Some people would put fiction in here. Maybe that's right. I don't want to put any argumentative weight on that. But think about what I want to call serious assertions, sort of institutionally serious assertions, that are not empirical descriptions. Think about the uses of legal language by judges in making a decision. You know, when he says, this is a case of strict liability, or a tort was committed here. That has the word-to-world direction of fit, all right. But it doesn't have anything corresponding to the feature of the toy acid example that was tasting it to be sour and observing the difference between the red litmus paper and the blue litmus paper. There aren't any observation reports in jurisprudential vocabularies. The facts of the case described in a non-legal vocabulary play a role somewhat analogous to observations in theoretical science, but there are no non-observation reports in legal language where the lawyers have been trained to respond non-inferentially to certain presentations by applying legal concepts. They can apply non-legal ones and then infer the legal concepts, but torts are invisible. You can't see civil wrongs. You can only infer them from other things. So I want to say that what distinguishes the narrower range of empirical descriptions is that in addition to norm governedness, they're representational in that sense. In addition to that, they are subject to a process whereby, and this is norm governed too, but it's an additional process, whereby the representings or the describings are subjunctively sensitive to what's described or represented, in the sense that if what was described or represented were different, the describing and the representing would be different. And that additional element is appealing to the two sides of non-inferential reports. Again, learning these lessons from Sellers, I sometimes call this the two-ply picture of non-inferential reports that he has. They need to be assertions, so they need to be taking up a stance in a space of implications. They need to be applying concepts. They need to be making claims. That's what the parrot can't do that we can do. But they also are, by definition, observation reports are the exercise of reliable differential responsive dispositions non-inferentially to make claims, to utter a perceptual, to express a perceptual judgment. And the reliability of those responsive dispositions is a matter of this alethic modal fact that if what was being reported were different, the reporting of it would be different. I mean, there's all sorts of qualifications on that, but still that's the picture. There's subjunctive tracking, subjunctive sensitivity, and that's expressed in an alethic modal vocabulary, not in a deontic normative vocabulary. People like Jerry Fodor and Fred Dretsky, the teleosemanticist is generally, except St. Ruth Millikan, try and have subjunctive tracking do all the work of normative governance. So in Fodor, his slogan is representation is a matter of one-way counterfactual dependencies. Counterfactual is used sloppily there to mean subjunctive. Subjunctive includes counterfactual cases, but also cases where no, this actually did happen, and so this other did. But he just means what I mean by subjunctive sensitivity, and that's the goodness of the inference from a difference in what's represented to a difference in the representing of it. Well, I want to investigate the way in which a practice in which descriptions are both normatively governed by what's described and subjunctively sensitive to it can be the processes that institute, maintain, and improve the Hlobil isomorphism. They're the way what really follows from what and what's really incompatible with what gets reflected in what we take to be a good implication or take to be an incompatibility. That is what was pointed to by that toy acid story. But you should have another question raised by making that claim. I'm saying that within the pragmatics, there's two fundamentally different but parallel dimensions of representational assessment. Normative governance of representings or describings by representeds or described, and subjunctive tracking of representeds by representings. And normative governance is specified in a deontic normative vocabulary. Subjunctive sensitivity is specified in an alethic modal vocabulary. We've seen that bimodal distinction before. It's fundamental to the Hlobil isomorphism between the norm-governed pragmatic use of the language and at least the metaphysics of the semantic, from which we draw the semantic interpretance of the semantic theory. And what we're seeing is that difference mirrored in the pragmatics, already reflected in the use of the language. And my claim is it's the fact that it's mirrored in inside the pragmatics that makes intelligible the obtaining of the relation between what's specified in a deontic normative pragmatic metavocabulary and what's specified in an alethic modal semantic metavocabulary. Well, I need to say more about this historical dimension and how this works. Just before the break, let me mention one twist on this. It doesn't particularly matter, I think, for what we're concerned with. It matters a lot to Sellers, and so I can't resist mentioning it. You know, Sellers is a nominalist. He thinks that things like propositions, universals, abstract objects are not, as he puts it, in the world in the narrow sense. The world is a world of stuff, not facts. I mean, in Late, he says it's a world of absolute processes rather than some other kind of particular, but never mind about that. But his argument for this is that all those other things I talked about, propositions, abstract objects, and so on, those are, talk about them is all to be understood to be metalinguistic. And metalinguistic talk presupposes that there's language. And what he means by in the world in the narrow sense is something that at least could be in the world, even if there were never any language users in it. I mean, you might ask yourself you might wonder how interesting that notion of being in the world in a narrow sense is, but it's a relatively clear notion. Does it follow, then, from something being metalinguistic that it can't be empirically describing what's in the world? I mean, we could just stipulate, well, by in the world I mean non-metalinguistically empirically describing the world. But can there be uses of expressions that are essentially metalinguistic and also are empirical descriptions of the world? And here at least is, it seems to me, a clear distinction. If it follows from something being metalinguistic, and I think Sellers thinks it does and has plausible arguments for it, that any non-inferential reports that you can make, which have to have this two-ply, there has to be the concept you're applying, and there has to be the RDRD, the reliable differential responsive disposition that's hooked up to it. And, you know, some abstract objects have observational uses. I can not only see that, you know, there's 3 pencils on the desk. Not only that the pencils on the desk are yellow, but I can see that non-inferentially that there's 3 of them. And I can, am I seeing the number 3? No, but I'm seeing the 3-ness of these things. But we can sharply distinguish between expressions that have observational uses. No expressions have only observational uses. They have to be in a space of implication, so they have to have some non-inferential uses. But of the expressions that have observational uses, some of them, it may be that the reliably covarying chain of events that underwrites your RDRD essentially goes through language use, that there's linguistic tokenings in that. That's a thing you could mean by metalinguistic, that any observational uses depend essentially on causal chains connecting them to what they're representing or describing that essentially involve languagings. So I'm not particularly going anywhere with that distinction. I just had all the raw materials to put that distinction too on the table, and wanted to do so in case it's sort of any use. There could be genuine empirical descriptions that were just languagey, essentially involving languagings in them. And you might well think that those are different from, that the things described are different, ontologically different, if they can only be gotten at that way. Okay, so the answer to one of the questions that I asked earlier then, that I've suggested now, is that the aspect of the representational dimension of conceptual content that is manifested in the distinction between attributing and acknowledging and is made explicit in the de re ascriptions of propositional attitude, that are the home language game of the distinction between what you're saying and what you're talking about in ordinary language. What that's manifesting is the normative governance aspect of descriptive discourse, which gives you the full notion of empirical description if you combine it with a notion of subjunctive tracking. Okay. When we come back, I want to talk about now this historical dimension. Okay, if you have these practices in play, how are we to understand the progressive character, or assessments of the progressive character of the change of conceptual content? That's, in some sense, we've got the raw materials of the normative governance and subjunctive tracking, but what can we say about the process, and in particular, the progressiveness of it? Okay, it's 2:16. Let's come back at 2:31.
Question about that last point. I don't know if I should wait till.
Okay. So what I want to address in the remaining time is the sense in which we can say that processes like empirical description, which I've argued has these two sides, the normative side and the elethic modal side, bring about improvements in, or better approximations of, a proper isomorphism between what really follows from what really is incompatible with what in the objective world, and what we take to follow from what and take to be incompatible with what take or treat to be as incompatible in our discursive practices. The way in which we could see processes like that, empirical description, but not only that, as bringing about the Hlobil isomorphism that we talked about. And I'm in particular interested in what we can say from within the pragmatic metavocabulary that I've been articulating here about progress towards a proper isomorphism as opposed to just an approximate one, and what processes could be thought to secure that. And here I think there's an overarching challenge that, defines a philosophical problem with the very notion of conceptual progress. And that is how to avoid winner's history. That is, what conditions can you put in on what you mean by progressing when you say, well, gee, I hope we're getting better at that, or I hope we're progressing. I believe that we would progress if we did this, and we won't if we do this other. not now asking an epistemic question about how you would tell whether you were right, asking the semantic question about in what circumstances can you mean something definite by that? In the face of, I don't know, the challenge of unchecked retrospective authority. You know, whatever comes later gets to redescribe the earlier stuff. And inevitably there's going to be some description from their point of view according to which this transition counted as progressive. Here you imagine the institutions of science being taken over by religious fanatics who regard our having moved from an Aristotelian picture where there was efficacy of place, different set of rules for the superlunary sphere than for the sublunary sphere, to early modern Cartesian through Newtonian physics that denies really the intelligibility of efficacy of place. And then Einsteinian geometric dynamics says, no, actually we can make perfect sense of the causal effect, anyway, of the efficacy of differences of place. They regard that sort of transformation as a shift in fundamental explanatory norms, comparable with the one that they instituted that added alongside predictive efficacy things like pleasingness to God as marked in our sacred scripture. And they say, see, we've been getting much better at that. We've been progressing in a scientific sense. And the challenge is to say something that won't be true if they take over, that won't count as progress given what you said about what would count as progress. But also that doesn't just say with Benjamin Jowett, the distinguished Plato scholar, I am the master of this college, and what I know not is not knowledge. So math and science we're not going to teach at Balliol. We don't just want to say, well, it's whatever we would say counts as progress. Well, no, these other transitions about the efficacy of place, you really wouldn't have persuaded the earlier guys, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't really progressive. What can you say about this? And that's particularly fraught if you want to say, well, our paradigm where we ought to be able to say at least what we mean by progress in our empirical description and explanations of things. But what if we don't have the subjunctive tracking condition? What if what we want to know is, well, what's progress in understanding the law? Where we say, well, we actually understand torts better than they did 100 years ago. We make better judgments about whether something is or is not tortious behavior. You could stamp your foot and say, well, it's my judgments now bind the future, but that seems terrible. If they really do know more, you should. That's what we're talking about. And you can't just let whoever comes later determine it, because it's too easy to tell self-justifying stories if you're allowed to change, what the parameters are, even to the extent that we do in big scientific revolutions, change the standards. And here I wanted to put on the table two ideas. One of them is very simple and the other is very complicated. And you don't have to take your pick between them. So one of them is, and I just want to say this because I think it's an interesting constellation of authority and responsibility. So, suppose you're tasked with explaining to Aristotle our scientific progress, what we understand that he didn't understand. And it isn't going to help to say, well, we can measure the mass of the electron to within 5 decimal places. The what of the what then? We'll get in Greek. That isn't going to help. And to say, well, we finally understand the precession of Mercury, going to have the same problems. We might be able to get him to understand the precession of Mercury, though even that would be an accomplishment. But when we tell him what we understand, none of that's going to mean anything to him. Well, this is a case where we actually know what it takes to persuade somebody, because we know why we have the Greek corpus at all, why it didn't just burn up with the Library of Alexandria. And that is when the Greeks were trying to persuade their Arab conquerors of the worth of their learning, the Arabs said, well, there is one point on which we know you understand things we don't understand. That's why we use Greek doctors, because the Greek doctors can save a warrior from a battlefield wound that we know is otherwise fatal, and can nurse people through diseases, through plagues, that we know kills almost everybody otherwise. And you guys can do that. How do you do that? What do you know? And the Greek doctors, bless their hearts, said, well, you've got to understand everything. You've got to understand us as a microcosm and the macrocosm and this whole thing. You've got to understand all of it. And they said, okay, then you can keep all those books. If all of them are needed to understand the medicine. And that's the only reason we have any of Aristotle, was that view. Well, it's an instance of a general thing. Aristotle could understand that we understand things he doesn't, that we know things he doesn't, when he sees how large a hole in the ground we can excavate or explode, or how fast we can go from one place to another, or how heavy an object we can move at speed from one place to another, because those are all things that he can assess basically as well as we can, just as the illiterate, I was going to say the illiterate warriors, some of them must have been, but sort of people of the book, they had to read the book. Anyway, the otherwise uneducated Arab warriors could understand the capacity of the Greek doctors, because it was a capacity to do something they could assess perfectly well, whether somebody was healthy or was ill. That is, I mean, those examples suggest that what keeps scientific theoretical progress honest and will let us get a grip on it is the technology that it allows. Why is that a help? Because the goodness of the technology is, and now I want to say, try out this definition. By definition, no, that's too strong. Much of the technological progress is prospectively accessible. You can measure the technology by its efficacy at doing something that you can already tell perfectly well whether and how well it's done. And if we put the requirement on the theory that it keeps the machines running, that it has to maintain the technology and improve that, where by that we mean so that anybody at any point looking at how well are you doing this thing, which we can assess prospectively, whether you're as good at it as we are, whether you're getting better at it. As long as you keep doing that, as long as your theory underwrites progress that is technological in that sense, the theoretical progress we may need to assess retrospectively. It's only from the point of view of the new scheme that we can do that, but at least some core technological assessments can be prospective and so put give us a point d'appui outside these later perhaps cockamamie or perverse theoretical evolutions.
Yeah, super interesting. So I'm wondering, with my tendency to go with Solarian terminology, one way that sort of naturally comes to interpret for me to interpret a case like that is something like, in some regard, scientific image has to, in some sense, be normatively guided by the manifest image. In some sense, because if I'm trying to go from one community to another, the norms that seem to guide inferences about the manifest image in medium-sized dry goods, in some sense, we can come back to those. So I'm more curious.
Okay, well, that's an interesting. I mean, that's a variant with a significant difference from the view I was suggesting. What's the difference? You're saying, well, there's the manifest image, sort of the life world, what perennial philosophy addresses, which is what we share with 5th century BC Greeks and 6th century BC Chinese philosophers. They're trying to understand that manifest image of things, change as it may, and one kind of technology would be getting better at techniques for doing those things better. So maybe, you want to persuade Kant, boy, if you could settle his stomach, if you had, and suppose Aristotle had fallen arches, and you say, you're on and on about the cobbler making the shoes. Can we make you a set of shoes? But your suggestion was, as I'm hearing it, one way to draw the line is things that are accessible within the manifest image, and that's sort of outside of, well, the scientific progress is going on over here. But I was suggesting that, but in addition to it, that any earlier phase of the science could have things that were scientific, depended on their theory, and so not part of the manifest image, but which it still made sense to say, well, what I mean by progress would, for instance, be progress in getting better at doing this thing which I can judge. So so I was suggesting a more inclusive notion of technology. I think both of them are there. They're relatively clear, and so maybe different notions of progress from that point of view. Yeah, and this might be relevant in particular if we're thinking cross-culturally or really cross-culturally, the Martians and so on, where we don't share any earlier stages with them, but at some sense we think, but the life world there must be points of contact with. Okay, I don't have any particular conclusion to draw from that, but one response to that, how do you put a check on the retrospective authority of the inheritors of your discursive practice to assess progress? so that you could now mean something when you say, well, I hope science continues to progress, that they would be getting wrong if they said yes and this counts. That was the challenge. And I was suggesting that though theoretical progress seems to build in this essential retrospective character, with technology we can allow authority from the earlier ones to bind the later ones. I mean, they may not care about being bound that way, but when we're talking about meaning something, meaning progress, we can do that. Okay, but the response I really care about is one that looks to historical development and to what's required to turn a past into a history, where a history comes with a story about which features of our development were progressive. You trace out a history as a trajectory through your past that's exclusively the progressive moves. So you say lots of what we did didn't, it was dead ends and false starts and lost retrogressive moves because we went down the blind alley. But I'm just going to pick out the progressive moves the way science textbooks used to do. And then Napier discovered this. And we don't worry about all the other people who were saying other things at the time. This is the one we go forward with. And I think this historical, the general nature of historical rationality, I want to say, is of much broader significance than the techno-fix I was suggesting might be our first try. And that's because we can extend the account that I mentioned last time of how normative attitudes can institute normative statuses into the full sort of historical environment. So I mentioned that when we make this distinction between normative statuses and normative attitudes, there's a question, well, which one comes first? Is it possible to understand the one in terms of the other? Does one come from the other, or what? So mostly the first half of this session I was talking about the distinction between attributing and acknowledging within the attitudes. Now I'm talking about that original distinction between attitudes and statuses. As I think I mentioned last time, Hegel thinks that the biggest single thing that ever happened in human history, the advent of modernity, not happening at a certain date, but a rolling, still underway process, is a shift between two broad shapes of normative self-consciousness. That's his terminology. A big shift in the commitments of the normative vocabulary that we use to understand ourselves. And that is, he thinks, traditional forms of life practically endorse the status dependence of normative attitudes. That is, the statuses, the normative statuses, are just there, and our job is to bring our attitudes into accord with them, so that there's an objective fact about what's fitting or proper, and we're supposed to learn that and accommodate our attitudes toward those normative statuses. Now, you can think of the normative statuses as natural or supernatural. They just have to be non-human for this to be traditional. the great chain of being, scala naturae, was a normative chain of superiority and subordination, that God at the top, serried ranks of angels till you get to the kings, the nobles beneath them, but all the way down to the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms. It's understood as being higher in that order is being superior, below is subordinate, in the normative sense where superiority includes the right to command, subordination includes the responsibility to obey, and your job is to learn your station and its duties. That's the title of F.H. Bradley's essay, My Station and Its Duties. And it was existentially disruptive. We became a different kind of creature with the advent of modernity and the idea of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. The idea that before we started taking or treating people as having the authority of a superior or the responsibility of a subordinate, before we started taking or treating them as having that status, there were no such statuses. And as I read him, Hegel's view in the phenomenology is it was purely progressive to, it was a progressive move to modernity. There's no going back, not recommending that. But just as the traditional view was one-sided, so is the modern view. In fact, we need a view that understands our attitudes as instituting normative statuses which we can then be constrained by, so that our attitudes must answer to those statuses that we've introduced. It's wrong to separate the authority from the responsibility in the way either that the tradition does or that modernity does. The disease of modernity, the worm in the apple of modernity, what he calls alienation and Fremdung, is your understanding of the normative statuses, commitment, entitlement, authority, responsibility, as instituted by our practical normative attitudes of attributing and acknowledging those, undercuts the intelligibility of those norms as rationally binding on you. If we just made them and could have made them differently, you lose that, lose the intelligibility of your grip on the sense in which you are bound by those norms, the sense in which your attitudes answer to those norms. And so the challenge is to give due weight to the attitudes and to the statuses. And I described last time Hegel's advance from Kant's way of thinking about attitudes as instituting statuses to a social picture where normative statuses are social statuses, but they're instituted by recognitive attitudes, attribution of that status, when those attitudes have the right structure, when they're reciprocal. That was the picture. But Hegel's introduction of the notion of history as equally important in understanding these structures of normativity as the social dimension was, is because he thinks that we can only see the real reciprocity of attitude and status if we think about the diachronic recognitive case. And the example that I always use for this is judges in Anglo-American common law and case law, that is where there isn't a statute that is being applied. In common law, it's often thought of as judge-made law, because all there is to determine what reasons a contemporary judge has to apply or not apply some concept, say strict liability, is the previous decisions that have been made. There is no governing statute at the beginning. And in case law, you say, well, there is a statute, but in order to interpret it, we have to go on the case the way it's been applied in the past. We're beyond where the wording of the statute can help us. And though I think of this picture as sort of compelling, the picture I'm working my way up to, of what the judges are about, there's sort of two schools, diametrically opposed schools of jurisprudence, ways of understanding what's going on there, one of which says, look, there aren't really any norms instituted in this process. The law is a bunch of decisions that have practical consequences, and any statement you make about what the law is really nothing more than a prediction about what judges would say if they had to apply it. So this is a very reductive sort of account, but it's opposed to an account that says, no, for each one of these things, there is a Platonic concept of what property really is. It's not just an arbitrary collection of rights and responsibilities. It has an essence, and judges are trying to get that right in making these decisions at civil law of whether the cow that wandered into your yard and the tree fell on it, so who gets the stakes from it, knock something down. These are the sorts of cases from sort of early common law, and to find out what the law is, there is this fact of the matter, there is this norm that's there, that their job is to accord their attitudes towards it, and so on. And as I see it, Hegel is saying, no, both of those are wrong. Each of you is overlooking something crucial. But in order to see the notion of reason that is in play there, we have to give up some of our ideas about what reasons are and what determinate conceptual contents are. So the picture is that we need to think about the structure of authority and responsibility in a diachronic community of judges. So the principle of stare decisis, respect for precedent, is acknowledging the authority of the decisions that have already been made, of the past judges. And the picture is that the only reasons that a contemporary judge can appeal to in giving a rationale for the decision, giving their reasons for the decision, the only reasons they can appeal to are reasons that they derive from the previous decisions. They say, look, this case was decided this way, this case was decided this way, and the principle that is sort of emerging here, I claim, is this, which, if you apply that principle to this case, is a reason to decide it this way. Now, it's entirely up to the contemporary judge what of the previous cases to treat as precedential. I mean, there are sort of precedents of treating these things as precedential, and so it's harder to pick something different and say, no, those aren't, kind of entrenchment of those things. But it's really more of the same. um, to decide that this case is precedential and to make judgments about what principle could be understood as having governed these, what norm can we see as having governed them. It can look as though all the authority is actually on the side of the current judge. In what sense is the current judge responsible to the authority of the earlier judges? If nobody holds her responsible to them, she can do whatever she wants in this decision. And so treat as a reason anything, whether it's really a reason or not, well, that is the notion that's liable to go missing. But what that misses is that the current judge does answer to other judges, the ones to come, who will decide whether to treat her decision as correct or incorrect, as having precedential authority or not, depending on their judgment of how well she responded to the responsibility she had to the prior judges. The later judges make that judgment about whether she actually properly acknowledged the authority of the decisions that had already been made, whether she was suitably responsible to the reasons that the tradition passed up. So she has authority, genuine authority, that decision sort of goes on the record, but the authority of the prior judges, her responsibility to that, is administered on their behalf by judges yet to come. And the picture is there is no final authority on that. That process is an open-ended process that obliges each judge to give her reasons in the form of an account of what norm can be traced through the trajectory of progressive applications of the norm, expressively progressive applications of the norm. That is, to be expressively progressive is for them to have shown us something about the reason relations, about the boundaries of the concepts that became explicit in the principle that, if you're subject to the law, you ought to have a say in determining it. We could see that principle as emerging from our battles about suffrage, who should have the vote. And we can see the principle that emerges from that seems to be this. Well, then should resident aliens have a say? Should children who are subject to this? It's raise the questions. Okay, but the form of a reason, of a legal reason, is a trajectory of precedential applications of the concept and a rationale, a characterization of the normative status, the thing that you claim always was binding us in the vicinity, which I'm showing how the different boundaries of it became more explicit so that I could formulate it this way as a rationale for my decision. In the same way, in the same spirit anyway, that one might tell the story of the concept of temperature and say, look, we discovered these various things about it. At this point, it was discovered that friction could increase temperature, and here we discovered that increasing pressure could increase temperature, and here we discovered that higher temperature means higher root mean speed of the particles in the gas, so on. That's empirically descriptive, controlled by observation reports. The legal case is not, but it's of the same general structure, where every bit of authority is balanced by a coordinate responsibility, just as in the synchronic reciprocal recognition case. It's just essentially diachronically done. And the claim is genuine reasons can work like that. And I want to claim the lesson Wittgenstein is teaching us is that reasons have to work that way. That's sort of all there is to rational norms, in the sense of norms that give us reasons to do things one way rather than another way. And this has the consequence, and this is the part that Hegel really cares about, is Kant, bound up in the old categories of Verstand, thought of determinateness of boundaries as there being a sharp boundary. This stuff is outside and this stuff is inside. And we might think, well, the boundaries aren't really things the concept applies to and things it doesn't, but inferences that you're committed to if you apply it, and ones that aren't, that's more fun. But that doesn't matter. The question is how we think about these boundaries. And that Kantian notion of determinateness of conceptual content is picked up by Frege. In his case, it's explicit. You have not introduced a concept unless your definition settles for every object whether it falls under the concept or doesn't. I mean, you may not be able to apply it, but it must settle that. And Hegel's view is essentially nothing is determinate in that sense. What you have is a process of determination. That's this process of reciprocal authority and responsibility that binds past judges, present judges, and future judges into a community that is determining the concept. And thought of retrospectively, from the point of view of the judge making the decision, that's always a finding out what the norm is. That's the form. You tell a Whiggish retrospective story of unbroken expressive progress in explicitating, clarifying the concept, making it explicit. From that point of view, you're just finding out what's there. That's what that school of jurisprudence was right about. That they were wrong about the kind of thing that the norm was, but they were right that responsible judges have to see themselves as applying already settled law, not as just making it up as they go along. But on the other side, the novel cases are not, if we look prospectively, the novel cases are, as they say, open-textured. There's room for a story that picks these things as precedential and applies the concept in this case, and for another story that treats others as precedential and sees a different norm as explained and decides this case differently. And we can even say, we can look at these cases where the later judges are not in any better position to pick between these than the earlier ones. So we can say that, no, these are really genuine live possibilities here. That's, from that point of view, prospectively, we see the justice in treating this as judge-made law. There isn't anything in these norms that wasn't put there by the judges who applied them in one case and didn't apply them in another case. Does that mean that they're not really reasons because there is this open text? No, that's what reasons are like. You have to get over a picture of reasons with these crystalline boundaries provided by, if you apply this concept, then you have no choice but to apply this other concept. Well, retrospectively, that's what the judge is saying. Prospectively may not be so. The opposition making finding is to be understood in terms of this distinction of temporal perspective between the prospective and the retrospective. Well, I think there's something compelling about this picture. I think substitute for those judges anybody who's applying a concept, plus, quas, whatever you're applying, whatever norm there is settled by the prior use of the concept, prior use of that term, insofar as it's settled at all. That's all that there is. But that doesn't mean that you can just decide to apply it or not. Yes, this counts as an insurrection. No, it doesn't. You are subject to, your decision there is subject to assessment by those coming after who are looking at those same precedents and may apply them differently. Okay, that's another way of thinking about what progress consists in, or what you could mean by progress, is this expressive progressiveness that consists in, anyway, is manifested in, telling these retrospective Whiggish stories. Whiggish in that the trajectory you trace through the past, the norm-defining history that you find, is a trajectory of unbroken expressive progress. Each step tells us a little bit more about the boundaries of the norm. And the thought I wanted to leave you with this time is, if you look at implication-based semantics, well, all right, maybe look a little bit farther back. Remember that if reason relations are open rather than topologically closed, they're not monotonic. We don't even impose cautious monotonicity. That is, we allow that explicitation, taking something that was implicit in a premise set, in the literal sense that it was implied by it, that making it explicit, that is, taking it as a premise, may change what we're implicitly committed to. That was the rational hysteresis, the path dependence of explicitation, by contrast to the notion of rational closure that says whatever path you take, you're going to the same place. You're going to the rational consequences of this set of commitments. So we have a formal model of how that works, even the minimal dog and pony show with the program, the explicitator that tracks these things out. Here's my thought, that recollective rationality, what's exercised by the judge, justifying her decision, showing her entitlement to the commitment, the practical commitment she's making in the judgment, that consists in discerning an expressively progressive trajectory, carving that out of the past. So a history that is making it a norm determining, just insofar as it is expressively progressive, that's telling a story about how this norm was implicit all along. And each step along the way was making something explicit that we can see retrospectively was implicit before. What does the judge do to do that? On the model, I want to suggest two things. You have to describe or specify a set of reason relations. You say, well, according to me, this follows from this is incompatible. Okay, you're really only working on some small region of a bigger thing, but you need to do two things. You suggest some sort of rejiggering of the reason relations, and then you show from some point, some precedential point in the past, you exhibit your trajectory as an explicitation path. That is, according to your recollective, retrospective, rational reconstruction of what went on, this decision was really just something they were already committed to by, think of the premises as the prior decisions that were made. They already, according to my story, implied this. This decision was just explicitly acknowledging something that was implicit. But now we see how telling retrospective stories like that is compatible with there being different possible explicitation paths that could have been taken. even though some specific, much further specified norm, if we're looking later on, is emerging from this. But that recollective rationality, making the past into a history, another Hegelian phrase is giving the contingencies of these concept applications the form of necessity, that is, a normative form, saying, no, this was the proper move to make. You were already, this was implicitly licensed or required by the commitments we have there. So my final suggestion is that that model of explicitation paths, you got to fix a set of reason relations and then do explicitation paths from some precedential point. With them, you have to be able to find an explicitation path to your current decision. That's the form of a recollective rationalization of the decision that you made. So, I mean, I don't know how to go very far with that model as I sit here in front of you, but it seemed to me that it nicely brought together some of the material about the form of reason relations earlier with this, I admit, vague, and I'm waving my hands at it, sort of historical direction of approach to talking about notions of progress that don't collapse all the authority either into some, either into now or into some future time. That this conceptual apparatus can help us be more explicit about the intricate constellation of authority and responsibility that we see in an ongoing tradition of prior judges, contemporary judges, and looking over our shoulder at future judges, or just concept appliers. Judges just do that in an institutionalized setting. Okay. Well, I hope that isn't simply dissolving into incoherence. That the next 2 weeks, I want to go back to somewhat firmer ground and look at how one might think about the content of subsentential expressions. Everything we've been doing so far has been at the level of sentences. As I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago, you didn't think propositional logic was as complicated as, or as sort of philosophically resonant as it is, but in the end we can't stay at the level of sentences. What are we going to do? So next time I'm going to talk about the criteria of adequacy, presenting the material from lecture 4 in Articulating Reasons, called What Are Singular Terms and Why Are There Any? That's a fabulous story, I think, and that's principally what I want to tell next time. And then the following time, well, how can we tell a story that plausibly will meet those criteria of adequacy, but that starts with implication-based semantics, with what we've got for the semantics of sentences. Okay, well, that's what's on offer. Yeah, Tushin.
Thanks. So I have a bit in the weed, a bit of a sort of Salazi in the weeds kind of question, but I figured if not here, then where could I ask that? So in his Locke lectures, one of the things that he invokes when expressing what's going on with the picturing relation is this kind of Peircean notion of sort of kind of final science of the end point or whatever. And it's, I guess this is really just kind of Sellers' exegesis kind of question. Is it sort of one way you can make sense of that is in, so there are two ways to make sense of that corresponding to exactly what you presented today, like a sort of prospective technological picture and a sort of simultaneously prospective and retrospective Hegelian picture.
I mean, the way I think about it, which may not be maximally charitable to Sellers, is he has a notion of progress in picturing, which is supposed to be a non-normative, matter-of-factual affair, which can be the Archimedean point outside every sequence of conceptual schemes that we use to judge more and less adequate ones. I think the one he's got can't possibly work, but there's a place in his system that occupies, that needs to be occupied. And I think you can get a lot farther with the technology story and with this story. The technology story, maybe he'd be happier with. This story is not going to meet. He thought that to do the work he needed it to do, it needed to be completely non-normative, something that was an objective matter of scientific fact. And this story about retrospective rationality as epitomized in the judges for legal concepts which are not empirically descriptive concepts. They don't have that essential element of picturing that comes from the RDRDs and the subjunctive tracking. He's trying to do it one-sidedly with that. But it is definitely that place in his system that I'm trying to fill or exploring ways of filling. Yeah. Okay. Well, be well.